Lads, hello. Hello. So I made a fun thing that is very fun. It's a black hole, except it's not textured, not animated, not realistic, not even volumetric. But I want you to look over here and take a quick second to guess how I did it. Well, now that I've given you about 3 seconds, I'd be very disappointed if you didn't have an answer for me. And the answer is obvious. Look at which tab we are in. We are in the world shader nodes. So, this is done in the world shader, which is quite a fun and totally understandable thing to do. Not really the product of buried psychopathy at all. But I want to make this a quick showcase of some of the fun things you can do with Blender when you're absolutely retarded. So, yeah, and without care for your own life. So let's start by the basics. So we need to build a form of render engine for this to display up in 3D space, or else it's just going to be, this stuff. So what do we need for that? For a basic ray casting engine, we need rays. We need one ray for each pixel. This is pretty easy to set up. We get the direction of our rays because we need two things for arrays. It's a line, so we need a point and a direction. We get the direction of our rays from just the generate or object or everything output of a texture coordinate node. Because look at what happens when we look up. If we look up, we're looking in the z direction, which correlates to blue. Same when we're looking down, right? All that fun stuff. Negative blue. Looking at green, we're looking at Y. Looking at red, we're looking at the X. Pretty easy to demonstrate. But yeah, so we have a direction. How do we get our origin? And I have this so handily named ray origin, which is actually a vector transform. If you set this to point, camera, world, set this to 0, you will pretty quickly see that this will correspond. This will give you the precise location of the camera as a vector value. If we go up, it'll be more blue. Down, it will be less blue. If you go in the red direction, or if we looking at negative X, will be, well, you kind of get the picture. Nothing too special about here. You can see it grows in magnitude as we go out. All that fun shit. So we officially have two things that we need to create a line. So, how do we make a 3D shape? So let's start doing some interesting stuff here. There are these things called intersection functions. These are mathematical functions that define a point of intersection using a ray. This is, by the way, another way to get the ray direction. It is functionally the same exact thing that you will see. There, you can see there's no difference. This is a bit more consistent with actual geometry, not just world shader madness. So generally I prefer to use this. So what does this intersection function do? It will generate what looks like a plane in the world shader. And this was the position output for that. So if we want to texture it, we can add in a texture, just a noise texture. That fun shit looks like we're looking down a plane. This is a mask for what is in the plane and what isn't. And this is the distance to the plane. We can see it goes really small as we get a lot closer. Larger at the edges for obvious reasons. It's a plane, it's farther back there. So this is one example of an intersection function. And by the way, we can change the normal vector here, and we can see sort of how it shifts the plane. Another example, which is lovely, is the sphere intersection functions. This makes what looks like a sphere. And the fun thing about this is if we take this, go into our object, and just make a cube. Set this to material. Grab that. And just set this as the surface output. We have a cube. But psych. This is how you get sometimes you'll see people, I'm not sure if this is often what you'll see, but people will have objects that look like other objects in rendering, and sometimes it's just vector displacement, but sometimes it can be stuff like this for the more advanced folks. Either way, fun shit. So how does that relate? So what we need to do for a black hole is we need to write this sort of raycasting engine, and beyond just intersections, we need to actually march the light and bend the light, because if we add no bending coefficient, which we can do by just changing this to 0, and let's preview that. Let's actually add in a little bit. I'm not entirely certain if we did something wrong there. Sorry, it doesn't seem to be working with 0, so we're just going to use some arbitrarily small value. You can see we're just going to get a flat plane, but if we up this a bit, you can see we start to get more black hole-esque results, right? So what we need to do is we need to take a very iterative approach to this, because as we know with light rays around black holes, they are not straight. Space-time curves them. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a good mathematical model that's efficient that can directly compute intersection points with between the geodesics of light across curved space-time with planes or spheres, because simply speaking, it's hard enough with a straight ray. Once you start bending it and getting into all that stuff that is beyond just simple polynomial functions, you'll get some difficulties. Although I'm certain there's some way to approximate if you have Fourier transforms or something. Although I'd question the accuracy of that a bit, because generally speaking, you can't solve for the roots of a fifth polynomial, so you'd be very limited. Fifth polynomial up, by the way. You can do it up to fourth, but those formulas are pretty complex. If you think the quadratic formula is bad, wait till you look at a quartic formula. Then again, there's stuff like Newton's method and all that stuff that you could theoretically do, but it's generally speaking more, it's generally speaking better, I believe, to just do short linear steps. So that's what I did here. So what happens is we take the input of the position and the direction, and each one of these node groups is a step. So what we do is we march this step and then recompute it in the next step, and each step is a recomputation of the direction and the position. It's like a for loop, right? So what happens, you'll see this is a little bit complex, but up here is we're computing the force. So you'll see we've got this position input, so we're sampling the position at a certain point. Take the length of that to get the distance from the position to the world origin. Then we're going to invert that and square it right here so that it mimics the shape, the forces of gravity. And then we'll take, since force is a three-dimensional computation and gravity is always pointing towards the center of mass, which is at 0, we will take the vector of the position, the position output, and that will be our scale, or that will be the direction. Well, actually, technically the opposite of the direction. That's why we scale this by a negative value. And then this is basically the scale, or the force multiplier right here. And then this is also another force multiplier, but it's actually the step scale. So we don't really have to deal with inconsistent forces when we change our step size, because keep in mind, forces are an integration, not explicitly a discrete computation. So if we're taking a smaller step, the work done during that step will be roughly proportional to the size of the step itself, which is why we include that. This is some pretty elementary physics stuff, although I won't blame you for not knowing, because a lot of people don't know a whole lot of physics. I'm just trying to explain the rationale. So what we need to do is we also need to take this direction and update it by the force. So this is simply an approximation, so I'm adding the force to the direction and then renormalizing it. If we don't do that, stuff can get a bit crazy like this, because you'll find the step size will increase a bit if you add a lot of forces, because these forces generally tend to compound. So this isn't entirely accurate, but it's a good and necessary step for the system to work. And then we take the position input, and we actually don't need this anymore because we do that up here. Keep in mind this is very cyclic, so if we do something like normalizing the direction up here and then we replug it back in there, the direction comes back normalized. Scale it by the okay, so this is actually another useful thing. So when we're scaling it by the position, what we want to do is we want to make it camera position independent as much as possible. So we want it to work the same back from here and from right here, and we want it to use roughly the same amount of steps. So what we do is we take larger steps when we're further away, and then closer steps as we approach the black hole. So for instance, our first few steps would be pretty large because we aren't really anywhere close, but once we get around like in the accretion disk and stuff, like our steps need to be pretty precise so that we can accurately compute this lensing effect. So that's what we're doing here, and we're scaling it by the step size, because obviously we need to scale by the step size or else we won't have an accurate thing at all. And then we add this to the position so that this updates our position, and then this goes right back into the position output, which will be cycled back to the position input. Same with all of these, by the way. This is how a loop in Blender works. You need outputs and inputs, and these get recycled and reforged and all that stuff. So that's how we get essentially the position and stuff, right? The position is often going to be actually very big, because we take a lot of unnecessary steps when we do this, because obviously it's Blender, we can only do so much. There are things we can do, but the direction vector is actually, since we normalize it every time, it's still always going to be normalized, so it's just essentially a rotation of what we usually get here. You can see that. Oh, you can see that pretty clearly, right? So how do we get from that to this? How do we render the accretion disk? So that's where this node group comes in. This is essentially like a density function. This is sampled each time. But where these things where these intersection functions come up is this, because we don't ever want to sample a point that's outside of our intersection, right? So, like, we don't want to say, if our accretion disk is at z equals 0, we don't want to get it showing up right over here, right, where it doesn't need to. So we need to create an intersection vector to figure out if a ray intersects the plane that is our accretion disk. And by the way, we can also twist this up. Actually, maybe that screwed something up. Theoretically, yes. Maybe I just broke it. I don't know. Complex node systems tend to be incredibly finicky, so don't be particularly alarmed if something goes awry every once in a while. It was like that with the planet shader. We'll just use this. It's a bit simpler and it looks about the same, even though it doesn't have some of the stuff. Either way. So that's why we're using this, and then this is just a simple modulation of that to make it look more like an accretion disk. But we don't want to sample the intersection and add that every time we update our trajectory, or else we're going to get a bunch of stuff that is absolutely not supposed to be there. So that's where this stuff comes in. This essentially checks if there is even a possibility that there is an intersection with z equals 0 at that point. So what you do is you take the z output of the position and then the z output of the updated position, and if it crosses the 0, in other words, if we can divide it and it returns negative, that means it crosses the 0 plane. For pretty obvious reasons, if you're going to intersect something, you're going to have to cross through it, and if we're crossing through a z equals 0 plane, how we cross through it is if the nz is at it has a different sign than the starting z. So that's sort of how that works, and then we just use this less than 0 because obviously we need it to be less than 0, and then we multiply that, and this essentially serves as just a mask. We're multiplying it by the color output here, which is the primary output. I haven't done anything with the extinction, so it's just adding to this if this intersects at the proper point. But yeah, this value every once in a while, like you'll see it overlaps a little bit, like there's a starting accretion disk and then you can see the refraction or whatever, the lensing of it behind it, so it doesn't completely occlude that. So that's why we're adding it to this, and yeah, we're just tracking the value output of all of these, which is pretty fun. So yeah, it's just a basic sort of thing. Yeah, so it looks like if this is going to be weird, we can just save this, open a new one. Yeah, there we go. And it's not perfect. It's a honestly relatively shitty render engine. It's not gonna do much. Like, I'm never gonna get volumetric shading to work on here simply because this is already approaching the node limit. But yeah, that's pretty fun. I want to show you guys something else. This is just sort of a preview of what's going on and why I've been busy. Well, part of the reason why. Stuff like this. This is what I am currently working on and actually going to develop into a product. It's a planet rendering stuff. It's not real time like the last one, but it's much higher fidelity, as you can see. Like, you can get all these nice details in the clouds. Literally perfectly photorealistic once it'll come out. Like, I'm not gonna, like, this is sort of alright, but I'm not gonna let it be unrealistic when it comes out. So you guys will have the assurance of the highest quality, but it will be a bit pricier than the others. I intend to price it around $50. It took so much work to get it right, and it honestly, even now, the results, I don't think there are any other things that can produce this in Blender natively. I know a lad by the name of Dennis Wu has done some excellent work with procedural earths and stuff, but his are less geared towards being realistic. I would say, I don't want to diss his work accidentally. More like I guess a realistic style interpretation of a planet, and certainly it looks fantastic for being all procedural. Don't get me wrong, but mine is certainly geared for being like the most realistic of the most realistic. And one thing that I would like to show, if I have it, I don't think I have it. Let's go to Blender. Doesn't seem like I do. Either way, this is meant to make realistic planets of all sorts. I will upload more videos tracking the progress of this and showing how to use it. But for now, that is it. Look at that cumulus cloud. It's pretty cool. Another thing, this is a freebie for all of you guys who enjoy such freebies. Y'all are going to love this. So, Blender's had very bad atmosphere shaders for quite a while. And the only good ones are, frankly, very expensive. Physical Starlight looks fantastic, but it's also $60. Anyways, this is my version. It is pretty cool, as you can see, and it looks pretty good. And I am just throwing it out there for free because it's not something I can justify people paying for. It's got rings, it's got all that stuff. Unfortunately, though, since you guys are not paying for it, I don't really have any incentive to upload any guide or manual on how to do this and really iron out all the kinks. But for your average need, it's going to be solid. You can, the fun things, rings, obviously. It'll light your scenes really well. Yeah, that's about it. Yeah, it's pretty fucking fast, so let's just add in a cube because we can. Yeah, so you're gonna get some stuff from the rings, and also a little bit of stuff from the sun. I'd recommend adding in your own sun lamp if you want to do this. It's not super difficult, but I think it works really well. Anyways, lads, that's about it. Hope you enjoyed this quick little breakdown, whatever, all that stuff. I am tired. I will get to sleep on the early side tonight. Not sure why I'm mentioning that, but whatever. See y'all.